Hi, welcome to our next edition of Product Talks, and I am so happy today to have Dr. Alan Widgerow with us. He's from South Africa, and he's a plastic surgeon, and he is the creator of the skincare line Alastin. Thanks so much, Dr. Widgerow. We're so happy to have you here on the show. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here. Yes, you're absolutely right. I am from South Africa originally, but I've been in California for the past 12 years. Plastic surgeon by profession and practiced in South Africa for 20 years, always involved in research and had an interest in research. So when we decided to emigrate, basically it was a really nice opportunity for me to get back into my passion of research, which I started at the University of California, Irvine, and I became part of the faculty there, and then eventually took over their research division in the Center for Tissue Engineering. So we run a lab there, and we do various projects, long-term projects related to adipose-derived stem cells from fat and all these sort of things. But then at the same time, after a couple of years, I got involved with when Alastin Skincare started up, their startup company. They asked me to help them with some of the theory. And it didn't take long before I became involved in developing products for them, and became a beautiful hybrid in terms of, working with trade and being able to get products out there really quickly, but using the same kind of advanced science that we use in the lab gave me a nice opportunity to actually put these two.
That's one of the things I like about your products and your science is you have a lot of great cell culture and lab data to back up the ingredients in your products. And the marketing people don't really get to talk about those things, so it can be complicated. So I thought it would be wonderful to ask you some questions today. And you have so many products that I thought today, let's talk about pigmentation, the dark spots you don't want. So two things, melasma, dark spots on the face, and the second part we'll talk about bruises, because they're both color on the skin that you don't want. So you have two great products for that. So let's talk about your A-LUMINATE Brightening Serum first. And that product is for any kind of hyperpigmentation on the face, such as melasma. First, let's tell the viewers a little bit about the multiple pathways and cells that are involved in causing hyperpigmentation, because it's actually a complex process. I have a textbook on pigmentation that's this fat. That's how much there is to know about pigmentation, but maybe you can make it easy on us and try to explain a little bit what causes hyperpigmentation.
Leslie, you're exactly right. And when I wrote, I wrote a summary of the paper and the science that we did. And the biggest challenge was really cutting it down, because there's just so much involved with pigmentation. And when we started and I looked at this area, I always try and look at what's the differentiation? How can we look at this like nobody else has looked at it? And from what I'd seen, really most of the concentration with most of the products out there is really related to one cell type, and that's a melanocyte. And that makes sense, because the melanocyte is the cell that produces pigment, and the enzymes involved, particularly an enzyme called tyrosinase, that most sort of researchers have concentrated on. If we can decrease the amount of tyrosinase and the enzyme that produces the pigment by the melanocyte, then maybe, we're going to win the situation. But the thought process that I had is this melanocyte, and this cell never works in isolation. We see this so often in my other studies that I do when we're looking at adipose-derived stem cells that come from the fat. They will actually elaborate different substances depending on what the environment is that you put them in, depending on what cells they react with, depending on what the situation is. So it's very variable. And so I try to recapitulate the situation for pigmentation. Now, firstly, pigmentation is not pigmentation. There's no standardized sort of pigment. They're different areas. So we've got the photo damage that occurs from sun damage that creates a certain type of pigmentation. We have the damage, what we call post-inflammatory pigmentation, really from devices, from inflammation, from acne, from areas where there's background inflammation that causes a certain amount of pigmentation. And then, of course, there's hormones involved. So we get melasma related to hormones and various sort of agents. So already there are three different types of pigmentation. And looking at that, the cell types involved there are different as well. So on the surface of the skin, we have what we call the keratinocytes and the epidermal cells. And these are the guys that first get the sun damage. And then they start elaborating different mediators that then affect the melanocyte and create pigmentation. And then also, what we've noticed, and I'm sure you've written about this as well, in the last couple of years, that these patients with melasma seem to have an increased vascularity. In other words, the blood vessels related to that area where there is pigmentation seem to be increased, and we couldn't quite work out what this was. Is this a hormonal thing? How are they getting the increased vascularity? And the cells involved in vascularity are the endothelial cells, the cells that make up the blood vessels. And there's a direct link between these and the melanocytes as well. So when we started investigating this, I said, hang on, when we start, and our first step is always gene expression, what are the genes that are expressed by those particular cells, and how do we influence the expression of those genes? We decided, let's take all three of those cells because they're working in unison, and we'll try and create a situation where there is a kind of challenge to the melanocytes to produce pigment. So we introduced a prostaglandin E, which is one of these potent stimulators for post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. And we introduced it to the melanocytes beforehand. And then we actually used various agents to see if we could reduce the down-regulate the gene expression in those areas. So to cut a long story short, 3 different pathways, 3 different cell lines, and I decided that's what we need to concentrate on. And we may find a whole lot of new agents that we haven't looked at, because traditionally we're only focusing on that melanocyte.
So you said melanocytes, endothelial cells, and what was the third cell type? I missed what you say it again?
Keratinocytes. The keratinocytes.
Okay.
Keratinocytes on the
I'm a Texan. I say keratinocyte.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So I'll have to keep apologizing for my Orange County accent.
I love your accent. It sounds better than mine. Okay, so that makes sense. So you looked at all 3 of those cell types, and the endothelial cells that are playing a role in the vascular contribution to pigmentation. Do you think that tranexamic acid is acting on those at all? Tranexamic acid, for our viewers, is a new oral pill that we've been using to treat melasma that works great. And it kind of blew everyone's mind because it doesn't do anything to the melanocytes that we know of. It's really more affects platelets and things in the vascular system. So now all of a sudden we're treating melasma with this, and it opened up a whole new thought about how melasma works. So I noticed you have tranexamic acid in your product. Is it affecting those endothelial cells? Is that one of the ways it's working?
So yeah, that's a great question. And we think it is. Tranexamic acid is what we call a plasmin inhibitor. So you're absolutely right. It has this effect. In fact, some surgeons use tranexamic acid to control bleeding after surgery because it has this sort of effect on the blood vessels. And then when we saw this, I've been using another agent that I was pretty excited about, which we used in what we're going to talk about, the bruising product before, and that's lactoferrin. And when I saw that lactoferrin was also a plasmin inhibitor, we had problems with tranexamic acid in terms of absorption. We knew that it was effective, but how do we get it down there? So we'll talk about that in a sec. But basically, I think it's working on both areas, because when I did the gene expression, there's a certain level that was involved with the endothelin, which is part of the endothelial cell. But there's also a breakdown within the keratinocytes where arachidonic acid, without going into a huge amount of detail, but a lot of the inflammatory areas involve plasmin and inflammation. And if you can block that route, you're also blocking it from that perspective. Now, the direct effect on the platelets and the blood vessels is also there. So that is something we're interested in. So when I started doing the gene expression, I took this lactoferrin and tranexamic acid, because they were both plasmin inhibitors, and various other peptides. And the amazing thing about the lactoferrin is it seemed to have really good effect on the melanocyte. So that was one new discovery we made. The other discovery made is the hexapeptide 12. So you know that our technology is based on something called TriHex technology, which is tripeptide 1 and hexapeptide 12. And the hexapeptide 12 often relates to elastin, and that's where we thought it's well known as elastin binding protein. But we made a discovery that hexapeptide 12 has another huge area of activity, and that's against the melanocyte as well. So we found that it downregulated the actual melanin pigment from the melanocyte, or the pathways related to that, by something like 12 times. So it was huge downregulation. So those two became the heroes there. And then we looked at the keratinocyte, and we found inflammation, anti-inflammation there. Hexapeptide 11 we found was really potent for that. And then with the endothelial cell, we found a product called phosphatidylserine. Now, I've used phosphatidylserine in a lot of different areas, and that is the one that I think may be involved in actually doing this vasoconstriction or decreasing the amount of blood supply there, because it affects the endothelium and the gene expression within the endothelial cells to a huge degree. That's where I think the big one is.
The hexapeptide 11, how does that prevent melanin? Is it a tyrosinase inhibitor, or does it affect the melanosomes or moving through the part 2?
Yeah, it's interesting because hexapeptide 11 we found was very, very good against the inflammatory mediators that are released by the keratinocytes. 2 in particular, one PGE2, prostaglandin E2, which I mentioned earlier on, and the other one is IL-18. And without getting too deep in the weeds, it's really interesting because interleukin 18 has been marked for an area of melasma where glycation end products are involved. Now, we're getting very, very deeply into it, but patients that over the age of 35 have got circulating blood sugar, those circulating blood sugar creates a reaction with a protein, and we get really high levels of stickiness in the extracellular matrix, and we found that it actually affects pigmentation melasma as well. And IL-18, in fact, it was only published this year in Experimental Dermatology about this connection with IL-18 and melasma. So I was thrilled when I saw this, because our biggest decrease in terms of hexapeptide 11 that you're talking about was IL-18, and second to that was prostaglandin E2. So they seem to be working very well on those.
That's interesting. Channels. So just to tell the viewers, so there are several pathways that lead to melanin. There's several things that have to happen. The melanocytes have to make melanin, which is the pigment. Then it has to package it, and it does that with an enzyme called tyrosinase. If you don't have tyrosinase, you don't make melanin. Then once the melanin's made, it has to packet these in these little packets called melanosomes. Then those have to move up the arms of the keratinocytes, and then they have to pass through a little doorway called the protease activator receptor 2 and get into the keratinocytes. So that's one part. The other part I'm hearing you say is that when the cells have to communicate with each other, and they use signals called interleukins or cytokines or growth factors. And so PGE is one of the inflammatory ones. That's actually what Advil works on, I think, ibuprofen. So PGE causes inflammation by turning on these cell signals, and cells tell each other, you need to be inflamed. And one of the things that happens is melanocytes get turned on. And that's why inflammation leads to pigment. So what is so new about your product to me is the role of the IL-8 turning on the melanocytes. We didn't really know that prior. So for years, people have been trying to block tyrosinase. That's what hydroquinone does, kojic acid, arbutin, many different things. We'll talk about that again in a minute. And niacinamide blocks movement through that part 2 doorway. But we didn't know in the past that we needed to block IL-8. So that's one of the things that is novel about your product. Am I hearing you correctly with that?
Yes, and in fact,
18,
Leslie,
okay.
it's IL-18. It's probably my expression, but it's 18, and it's really interesting from that perspective. And you brought up Hex 11 as well, and you explained it so beautifully in terms of the movement of the melanosome and the pigment. And then the pigment has to be transferred from the melanocyte to the keratinocyte, and then it sits superficially where we see it on the surface of the skin. And Hex 11, the other side of Hex 11 is that it's something that it stimulates something called autophagy. And this is the body's way of actually getting rid of a whole lot of waste products, either by repackaging or speeding up the process. And in the case of melanogenesis, in fact, in the case of pigmentation, the deposition of that melanin into the superficial layer can be sped up by stimulating this process of autophagy. So by using that, you're actually getting an almost immediate effect on the existing pigmentation. Not only are you preventing new, but the existing pigmentation is being broken down on a much less inflammatory process than using peels or acids or exfoliants to try and get rid of that pigmentation by stimulating the autophagy. So that's another sort of area that was really interesting to us or new
I'm going to put
science
a
related
link
to that.
down below the video about a blog I wrote on autophagy so the viewers can learn more about that and cellular senescence. But that's the big thing in anti-aging. It sounds like we're going to have to do another one of these on aging in the future because there's a lot of overlap here. So when I tell my patients when I'm trying to treat melasma that I want to hit that melanin pigment production pathway everywhere I can. So I want a tyrosinase inhibitor. I want a PAR2 blocker. I want something that's going to exfoliate. I want antioxidants to decrease the inflammation. And I'm looking in your product and it looks like you have all of that covered. You've got niacinamide blocking the PAR2.
Yep.
You've got, now which of your ingredients are tyrosinase inhibitors? Are any of them?
Yes, you'll find there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of that. So tyrosinase, so we did a second part. I haven't even talked about that. I'm busy talking about the gene expression, but the second part was really looking at a melanocyte model. We said, okay, we've got now all these different players, but let's see now if we take the ones that are affecting the keratinocytes and the endothelial cells in particular, and now let's use melanin. We'll put it into a model now. We'll produce actual pigmentation, and then we'll see if we can reduce the pigmentation in that model. And that's where the tyrosinase came in, because we looked at specific tyrosinase inhibitors. And in fact, almost all of those work in tyrosinase as well. They are tyrosinase inhibitors from that perspective. And we also took quite a few well-known agents that have worked against tyrosinase. Silymarin, for example, was a really nice one that we included as well. The problem there also absorption, so we covered that with a liposome, something that will get it in easier. So it's like you say, the expression I use is you have to sort of look at this almost like it's gambling. You've got to cover as many odds as you can. There are just so many different variables and different pathways that the more pathways and the more cells that you cover, the greater the chance of success.
Well, historically, we've always told our patients to take a break from their tyrosinase inhibitors. We'll like to treat patients 3 to 4 months and then take a holiday. I can't decide with your product, do you need to take a break from it? It doesn't sound like it's the traditional tyrosinase inhibitor.
No, it's very different. And I think that's a very important point, because what we want to do here is we want something that's going to work long term, that is not going to irritate. And, and basically at the back of my mind, I've got this hydroquinone all the time, because this was the quick one, the one that really worked fast. Hydroquinone was effective, but it was effective with a bit of problems in that it caused quite a bit of inflammation and redness. It's toxic to the cells, so that's the way it worked through the toxicity to melanocytes. So it's an aggressive sort of way of doing it. So we wanted to introduce something that you could use before you did. If you were going to do a procedure, for example, with the device, you could use this before to prime the skin beforehand without the aggression, and then afterwards to have something that maintained it. So the tyrosinase is a very secondary issue with our sort of facts and the science that we use here. We're primarily looking at a whole lot of the mediators that you mentioned earlier, the cytokines, the mediators, the things that are released by the cells when they're stimulated to make this melanin. So that is a sort of different process to the tyrosinase story. And that's why we can use it long term.
So we were all trained in our dermatology residencies to pre-treat people with darker skin types with hydroquinone before we did a peel or laser or some sort of a treatment that we were worried they're going to pigment, because even though we didn't know IL-18 was involved, we knew that inflammation caused pigment, and so we would try to prevent it with hydroquinone. But your product is being used a lot now for pre-treatment, and you were saying it's more because it doesn't kill the melanocytes and it doesn't cause any inflammation. Is that really the main reason you think this is better for pre-treatment?
Yeah, I think that what's happened is through the experience that we've had, we started with, and I'm sure you're familiar with our Nectar product that we started with. And one of the main thrusts of that product was really preconditioning. And this is taken on in such a big way. We're even doing body contouring invasive plastic surgery now, where surgeons are really preconditioning these patients, because we found out that if you get these cells actually tuned up beforehand, and you can change the milieu of the what we call the extracellular matrix, the area where you make collagen and elastin. And it's really all about cell talk. We talked about this earlier on. And in fact, at University of California, Irvine, there's a group of researchers that have created the software program called just that, Cell Talk. And that's based on now single cell sequencing. When they do gene expression, they can put this together in an algorithmic model and actually work out what that conversation is between the cells related to the genes. So the cell talk is really so important. But that cell talk does not happen when you've got aged, old skin that has been there for quite a while, because what happens is your collagen is broken up into small pieces, your elastin is broken up into small pieces. Your cells, which are your fibroblasts, which normally stretch out and relax on the collagen fibers, and that's where they talk to the proteins, that cannot happen in the older skin. So we're saying precondition, try and improve that situation so that whatever procedure you do, that cell talk is going to be optimized, and the instructions that come out are going to lead to better outcomes and better experience with it. So we believe very strongly in preconditioning, but not preconditioning aggressively. Preconditioning just to get a healthier milieu in which either the surgeon, physician, or just
right, because you don't
maintenance
want inflammation starting before you injure somebody. Because then you want the injury, which chemical peel is a type of an injury, or microneedling is a type of an injury. You want them to heal fast from that. So basically, old cells, they don't communicate very well because they don't send signals well and they don't hear signals well. So I wanted to try to focus on just two of your products because you have so many great ones. But since we're talking about the nectar, I have to say I love using it before procedures. And the way I explain to my patients is you get all this old chopped up collagen in between your cells that blocks those signals. They can't, with all that junk in the way, the signals can't move between cells as well. So your product is the only one on the market that has been shown to clean out that old collagen, which maybe that's with autophagy also. I'm not sure the mechanism, but you get rid of all that old collagen, and then it gives space for these IL-18s or the good ones, the healing growth factors to talk to each other. So, and that's why you heal better.
Yeah, exactly. And Liz, we use this analogy of gardening that, you got to remove all those weeds and you got to clean up and you got to turn the soil and you got to get some really good stuff before you start planting. And it's the same story here, is you got to replenish that extracellular matrix so you can optimize the environment for whatever you're doing.
Right. And 2 weeks seems to be the magic number. So even if we're doing Ulthera or microneedling or peels or anything like that, we really prefer if they've been on the nectar for 2 weeks ahead of time. And now you're telling me if they're going to pigment, put them on the nectar and the Illuminate so you can prevent pigmentation as well.
So you can use the Illuminate alone. You don't need the nectar in that situation because the Illuminate is doing things to those particular cells that we're interested in. The nectar, we were really interested in the fibroblasts and what was happening with the fibroblasts. Here with the Illuminate, we're working on keratinocytes, we're working on endothelial cells, and we're working on melanocytes beforehand. So we're now attuning them beforehand to get them ready for what's coming. And so you don't need the nectar in that kind of situation. The nectar is good for, as you say, collagen, elastin. And basically what we did there was the experimentation as well showed us that we release an enzyme, which is gelatinase and MMP2, but that's what actually eats up those fragmented collagen and elastin, gets rid of them. And that optimizes around about 18 days, and then it comes down again because there's something that gets rid of that enzyme as well. So that's a different kind of story. But the actual concept of preconditioning, I think, is very relevant to pigmentation as well, especially if you're going to use this.
So will A-LUMINATE get rid of those weeds as well? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So I see you have 4 different kinds of liposomes in the formulation. And for the viewers, liposomes are these spherical shapes of the way fatty acids line up that makes things get through the cell membrane better. But why do you need 4 different kinds?
Yeah, that's a really also great question because, and let me just say that John Garuda, I'm not sure if you know John, but John is a superb formulator. He's been in the business for a long, long time. And he's my partner in crime. We work with him very closely. John designs these liposomes, and we've discussed this so often because very often you have very big molecules, and a liposome, it's almost like a shapeshifter. You can surround these big molecules and it adopts these different shapes that get themselves in between cells and allow this absorption to take place. Now, there were some very special situations in the pigmentation realm with the agents that we used. Firstly, we mentioned tranexamic acid. Now, tranexamic acid, as we talked about before, always has a problem in terms of absorption. So topically, it's quite difficult to get it to absorb. So we actually created a special liposome for tranexamic acid. We said, let's get it down there more effectively, number one. Number two, our actives that we found, these newly discovered lactoferrin, hexapeptide 11, hexapeptide 12, we have our own liposome that we've designed before that works beautifully around there. We can wrap it around all three of them and get it down there. So that's number two. Number three was the silymarin that I also talked about before. Also, a little bit of instability and difficulty in terms of penetration. So we have another one there. And the fourth one is a little change in the liposome. It's called a photosome. And it's one of these that is really produced or manufactured with the sole intention of trying to repair some of the DNA damage that is done by the sunshine. So when sun shines and you get damage to the cells, the first area that is struck is DNA, and you get what's called DNA dimers, and these have to be repaired by the body. Otherwise, they can lead on to certain cancers that we get from sunshine. The photosome has a repair mechanism in there, so it became a beautiful kind of synergy to say, okay, if we're dealing with melanogenesis, let's try and deal with some of the damage that is done to the DNA at the same time. And that's the fourth
In
liposome.
fact, that damage to the DNA from the sun triggers the whole tanning process. That's what a suntan is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
that's really dangerous.
Any of the viewers who've read anything I've written about peptides know I'm not a peptide fan, because we know that anything bigger than 500 kilodaltons doesn't get into the skin, and peptides are very unstable in shelf life. They don't play well in the sandbox with each other. They inactivate other ingredients. So that is why those 4 different liposomes are so important, because they're overcoming those issues. Is that correct?
Yes, to a certain extent, I must say. And Leslie, one of the first things that I look at when I choose, there are a number of things that I do with the peptides before I select them, but one of the things I look at is molecular weight. And our peptides are all between 500 and 800 daltons. So in terms of them getting through the skin, as opposed to a growth factor, which is, 15,000, 150,000, 200,000, these are huge elephants that you have to get through there. So the peptides we choose are very much smaller. So most of them can actually get through, but the liposomes just get it there more effectively and faster. And one of the products we're not even talking about today, but our body product, especially when we're doing cryolipolysis, freezing, or even RF, where we're actually trying to reduce the amount of fat with a device. Basically, we have a topical that aids in that as well, but we need to get it right down very fast. So we designed a liposome that gets down the hair follicle. So even though it will get through the skin, if you put it down the hair follicle, it's going to get there faster and deeper. So most of the liposomes, you're absolutely right, is we actually use them because we get them down there quicker, and it's a very effective way of getting it through the skin. But the peptides that we use in particular are very low molecular weight.
So with the silymarin and the peptides in there, we have to worry a little bit about shelf life and interactions with other products. Are there any things that people should avoid using at the same time? For example, if they used a low pH cleanser before applying the A-LUMINATE, would that cause any problems? Or if they put vitamin C on before, would that cause any problems?
Yeah, I got to tell you that we do our 3-monthly adverse event. Every 3 months we look at this, and we're very strict about the whole story. And we have an extremely low, even though we're working in the procedure area, it's between 0.04 and 0.07% across the board. That's with nectar, with everything, even where it's being used in those. But 99% of the reactions that we see are from what we call compounding. In other words, people are mixing different agents with it. And it's so unpredictable in terms of what is going to happen, because you don't know what is being used. You don't know, as you say, what's the pH, so the only things we can vouch for, and it sounds crazy and it sounds like a sales story, but we know how our products work together. So we know that if you're using those together, we're absolutely fine. From a perspective of the pH and basically in neutralizing whatever effect you have by doing something beforehand, we try and get people to use the A-LUMINATE as the first sort of story. It goes in quickly, it's absorbed really fairly efficiently. We would only use HA Immerse, which is our HA product, which we're not talking about today, but that's a very thin product that gets in really quickly. So I would say use that first. So thinner to thickest is what we would, the way that we do it. And Illuminate comes in there pretty, I like to get those actives in as quickly as possible. So to try and avoid them just being disturbed by another product beforehand.
Well, my specialty is taking products and building regimens for people's skin types. There's 16 different skin types. So that's my thing. So what kinds of chemical issues do I need to worry about when pairing this product with other ones? Is there anything specific that is a no-no? And I don't mean that it causes adverse events, really, more that it will inactivate it. Like, for example, retinol gets inactivated by light. Is there anything that's going to inactivate your active ingredients?
Yeah, fortunately, with the active ingredients that we've got, there are no obvious things. You don't need aluminum containers. You don't need to protect from light. You don't need the pH will not, unless it's radically alkaline, it's not going to be problematic from that point of view. So really we found, and the shelf life is pretty good as well. And we've done all the RIP tests and the hyperallergenics and the comedogenicities and all these sort of things that should go along with it. So I'm happy to say that there's almost nothing that I can tell you that you can't mix with this that is going to neutralize it. But I would be much happier if you use it earlier rather than later in the program.
Right. And do you have any kind of, once you open the product, do you need to use it within a certain amount of time? Do you need to refrigerate it?
Well, no, you don't need to refrigerate it. And because it's a daily routine that we talk about morning and night, it's best, and for pigmentation especially, this is not something that you can use once a week kind of story. This is an ongoing, so it's a daily story. You keep using it, and you shouldn't it shouldn't run out of its efficacy before you run out of product. So I think that's what's going to happen.
I coach people that once you open something, try to use it up in a month if you can, because maybe we're in Miami with the humidity and the heat. But you're right. You need to use it. You spent all this money and time buying it. You need to use it. And then if you throw it in a cabinet for 6 months, I think you need to throw it away and get another one.
Exactly. So, if you're using it and it's a fairly large area, 46 weeks is what this should last you. And
right. Okay, let's switch over to the INhance post-injection serum, because I do a lot of injectables in my practice. I do all the FDA trials, getting Restylane, Juvederm, and all the different fillers approved. And the big thing is always bruising. And the doctor can't always control the bruising because a lot of it has to do with what the patient did before they saw you. Did they take ibuprofen? Did they eat salmon? Did they have red wine the night before? So and the patient thinks it's our mistake when they bruise. So we look like we don't know what we're doing, even though it isn't what we did that caused the bruising. So this product is so key. Also, the downtime that you have after procedure, and this product, I bruise like crazy. Redheads bruise a lot. And when it first came out, I didn't believe it because I had done a lot of studies on arnica and bromelain, and nothing ever really worked. So I put it on a bruise I had on one side and not on the other. And I was shocked whenever it worked. And I remember contacting you, and you sent me some fabulous data about how the lactoferrin makes the macrophages go in there and eat up all the hemosiderin in the skin. And I thought, wow, they really have science to back this up. So tell me about the ChromaFade technology, how you thought of it. I mean, how did you ever think of lactoferrin? Because I hadn't heard it. Nobody was talking about lactoferrin prior to that.
Yeah, and those are all great points, and exactly why we looked at this, because bruising has been the sort of challenge of the age. How do we control that? And as you say, we look at whoever's the injector, look at that like they've made a mistake if there's bruising, but it's inevitable. It's going to happen, and it's not because of, most of the time, it's not because of operator errors, because that's just the nature of where we're working, and you can use cannulas and you can use all sorts of things. So what happens is we have unwanted cells in an area, again, where they shouldn't be. So I'm phrasing it like that because the first lesson that we learned when we were developing our body product was really there to try and get rid of some of the lipid droplets from fat that was created by procedures like cryolipolysis. And we got into a whole nother area of dealing with waste products. And now, when I look at so many of our products, including Nectar, and we talked about this with elastin and collagen before, when people ask me in one line, what are you in? I say, I'm actually in waste management, because that's that's what we're doing. We just need a much sexier term for it. But essentially what's happening is, with so many of the processes that we use, and this is common to diseases across the board. If you look at Alzheimer's, for example, Alzheimer's is this accumulation with time of beta amyloid, tau proteins, all sorts of things that create the problems. And that's part of the actual disease process. If you can get rid of them, you can improve it substantially. So here, let's get back to bruising. What's happening? We create a situation where the blood vessel now has been ruptured or opened or pierced, and we have red blood cells that are now actually filtering into the tissue. And when it does that, red blood cells, of course, has pigmentation called hemosiderin and hematin and various pigments. And that causes the sort of blue color and the variations going from blue to green to purple to all sorts of colors as it's recovering. And that goes through those various colors because the macrophages, which are the vacuum cleaner cells of the body that actually absorb these and then take it and get rid of them, have a level of efficiency that actually goes with the color. In other words, as they become more efficient, the color seems to disappear. So the first thing we thought about is, okay, we actually managed to stimulate those macrophages to work nicely when we were working with the fat situation. What about tuning them in to the red blood cells now and seeing if we can get rid of those red blood cells earlier? And we did a very sophisticated model where we created a model with the macrophages and the red blood cells, and we could tell when the macrophages had engulfed them, and we could actually do absorption of the red blood cell spectrum, so we could see how many cells that absorbed. And then we started with different agents. And lactoferrin was one of those that was fascinating to me because the plasmin inhibition is one thing, but it's also an iron absorber. And what do the red blood cells do is they give out iron and hemosiderin and all this. So if we've got something that absorbs iron at the same time, that may be very useful. So we added the lactoferrin there, and again the phosphatidylserine, and we tried the various peptides. Anyway, we got down to a formula where we could improve the actual efficiency of those macrophage vacuum cleaner cells, where they were actually absorbing 45% more red blood cells than the no treatment story. In other words, we could get these super efficient house cleaners of red blood cells coming in and getting rid of them a lot faster. So that was the step number one. And partnering with injectables, bruising is the one thing. But then there's also swelling, there's also maybe a little bit of discomfort. So we've added things for swelling and pain and discomfort. We found that we could improve the bruising. And then at the same time, by using our TriHex technology, one of the early things that we discovered is we could stimulate more collagen, more elastin with our product. And with your fillers, basically, we know that purely by filling and creating this volume, the expression of the fibroblast is produce more collagen and more elastin. So actually, you're producing a little bit more collagen and elastin even with your fillers. So by having this product that actually stimulates it, and the amazing thing is that we showed in 10 days, we could produce this effect from the biopsies that we could actually show. And some of the new stains that we used for elastin, like Mobat, actually showed these very new fine fibers. So we were getting reduced bruising, we were getting reduced swelling. If you didn't get bruising, well, okay, even if you use the product, you're going to get the synergy of stimulating new collagen and elastin, which became a great partner then. And you know, Leslie, this is our philosophy, is we want to be there, not in competition to anything that any of the dermatologists are doing. We want to be there as partners to it. Let's try and improve the outcomes. Let's try and get healing optimized. Let's get this done faster. Let's see whatever device or agent we're using, can we improve the outcomes for the patient and improve the experience.
And you might be saying that because a lot of dermatologists use a 585 nanometer laser or 595 nanometer laser to zap away the bruises, but it gets that hemosiderin out, just like you're saying the cream does, but the lasers don't get all of it. So I think using them together is really better. And I have my patients, when they come in for a laser, start applying the cream. Usually they take the cream home with them, and if they start to bruise, they'll use it. But they still come in and get their laser treatment to make it go faster. Right. Also, some of my patients get confused and they use the INhance serum to prevent bruising when it really is more to treat bruises. But now you're saying that it blocks some of the inflammation. Tell me about that. Would it prevent a bruise at all?
Yeah, and again, I'm a big proponent of preconditioning that I said, but in this situation for bruising and for the fat story with the body, I tell people this happens after you've created this. In other words, the red blood cells now are out there in the tissue. The lipid droplets and fat are out there. Now the product can work. To do it preconditioning before the event happens doesn't make a huge amount of sense, as much as I like the preconditioning. So the swelling as well, for the mediators and to decrease the amount of cytokines and inflammatory mediators, they will be really primed once you do your procedure, and sometimes less than other situations. So no, I don't see a real good reason. The only reason I would say you could do it was for the elastin collagen stimulation. Okay, so we're going to do that. That may be beneficial, but I don't have a strong
If we wanted to stimulate collagen and elastin prior, would we be better off using the Nectar or the Illuminate or the INhance in that situation?
You probably got the same amount of the TriHex concentration in both of those, so it doesn't really matter. But I think the Nectar is traditionally is the one that we use for preconditioning because there are other agents within that are good for the preconditioning, and but particularly for laser or open ablative sort of procedures, then the Nectar is great for that. The INhance and our Transform Body product, as I say, I would use just after the procedure, not as a preconditioning. Nectar, as you say, is our preconditioning sort of.
And then we've been talking a little bit about prostaglandin E and how we don't really like it because it causes inflammation. Again, that's what ibuprofen targets. Does this product, the INhance post-injection serum, does it target the prostaglandin E at all?
Yeah, it does, and it does it with a different, agent, and it's one of my favorites as well. It's there's a product called phytofluin, which is really made from the saltwater algae that they picked up in
Will you say that word again?
Areas, and this phytowin and phytofluin, and it is from saltwater algae, and it is potent in terms of its anti-inflammatory effect, and particularly related to PGE2 as well. So it's another favorite of mine. Wherever there's procedures being done where there's inflammation background, I think it's a really nice agent to use. There are others, but that's one of my favorites.
Well, with your background as a scientist and wanting evidence-based research, I know it was a challenge trying to do bruising studies because I did all these arnica trials in the past, and we hit but prior to me, people would hit people with a rock. We had to use a laser to make bruises. Yep. How did you make your bruises? It's not an easy thing to bruise people.
No, I'm laughing. Really, what was available on them? I had two choices. I could shoot somebody with a paint gun, or I could drop a weight on them. And I decided, what, this is just not going to do our company very much good. This is an inelegant way of doing things. So really what I did there, and funny you mentioned, while it's in my mind, you mentioned arnica and ledum. And arnica, we have proponents and followers, and you can't sort of change their minds about arnica. People actually swear about arnica. And when we did the tests related to the bruising, it was interesting because we found it really didn't help with the bruising, but where it did help was it decreased the secondary inflammation related to the blood products. So in terms of wound healing and decreasing inflammation, it was great. So we actually included it, but as the double whammy for whatever red blood cells you can't get out there and it's still causing inflammation, the arnica will help there. But don't expect it to help with the acute bruising.
I published a study in the 90s where we bruised, back when vascular lasers would bruise you. We bruised both sides of the face, and we used different form. Arnica was a split face trial, and it did not work on the bruises at all. And that was a big publication because, like you said, everyone believes in it. We still used it. We still love the pads that have the arnica in it because of the getting rid of the inflammation, like you said. But we haven't seen it do anything to bruises you already have. In fact, your product is the only one I've seen work on bruises you already have. Even the vitamin K products, I haven't had good results with.
Yep, exactly. No, I'm with you 100%. So I diverted.
Well, you were telling me, how did you bruise people?
Oh, yes.
We don't want to forget to learn that because that's fascinating.
Exactly. No, we try to be a little bit more elegant. So I worked with Melanie Palm and with Kerry Jacob on this, and one group we did a blood withdrawal, and on one group we let them just bleed, which is not nice, but they bruise like mad if you don't put any pressure on. So that's great. It's sort of semi-control. We did both sides. And I'll tell you about that in a second. The other group, we actually withdrew blood and then injected just under the skin so that we could create an actual bruise that way. But then what we did as well was, instead of using the naked eye, we used a calorimeter. In other words, something that automatically calibrates the color and records the color. And you can do the channel between the sort of green, blue, purple kind of channel. And that is far more accurate than the naked eye. And the first thing we did is, you can't compare two sides doing that because they're never going to be the same. But you can group everything together and say, okay, now do we have equivalent bruising or intensity of color in two groups? And now we can start comparing them. And that's what we did. And then on the one side we treated with the Alastin product, and which is the INhance, and the other side we treated with a bland moisturizer, pooled everything together to make sure that our baseline started at the same intensity, and then followed them over a number of days. And then we showed that around about 2 or 3 days was where our tipping point was, where you suddenly saw, hang on, one group is decreasing on the colorimetry. That purple was disappearing faster than the other group. In fact, 75% of cases was quick, and we could show that the bruising was disappearing that way. So I think a little bit more elegant than paintballs and dropping weights, but it's a tough model.
And you probably don't have any studies or data on this, but is there anything else besides bruises that you could put the INhance on that it would make it go away faster? Because you're talking about getting rid of the weeds. I'm trying to think of all the other things we wish we could get rid of in dermatology. Is it very specific to the red blood cells, or would it work on other things too?
So the Hex 11 that I've talked about, and this keeps coming up, and you've written about this, is autophagy. And Hex 11 stimulates autophagy. And autophagy is this, when I talk about waste management, autophagy is our body's way of really doing beautiful waste management. And it's very clever, because when the cell is not badly damaged, it has a way of actually making that cell survive by doing certain things. But when it's really badly damaged, it has a way of speeding up the process of getting rid and recycling and getting rid of some of the parts. So the Hex 11, one of the early studies that we did, really showed very good stimulation of autophagy. And I think that, as you know, autophagy comes into so many different processes. So we've used it now for fat, we've used it now for bruising, and I think there are going to be many other situations where we think, hang on, what about stimulating autophagy here? Won't that speed up the process? And it just keeps coming up, So I think there are going to be a lot of other possibilities related to this. The interesting thing in invasive surgery that we found that was a little different from the cryolipolysis and the the fat that we were doing there, was that we found that with liposuction or with tummy tucks, things like that, we've got this sort of delayed internal scarring at about 4 to 6 weeks, where patients sort of it restricted their movements, and it was tight, and it became really uncomfortable. That was the area that we could actually reverse very well. And we did this, we document with gene expression and a whole lot of different things to show that we could actually decrease the internal scarring that is happening 4 to 6 weeks down the line. And that seemed to be related to the inflammation from lipid droplets there, which was very interesting as well. So I think you're right. There are going to be a lot of different areas that we can look at, say, hey, it's worked here, let's try this.
You're making me wonder if it would work on keloids. No?
I don't think so, because there it's such a different animal compared to exaggerated, what we call hypertrophic scarring. It's genetically modulated some way that this just keeps on growing like a tumor, and we have to get in there and find out what the pathway is that is stimulating this in certain people. And that's
right. Well, I think it's so funny how you said that you're a specialist in waste management and you wanted a sexier term, and now autophagy is a sexy term now. Everybody's talking about it. People out there that are doing intermittent fasting or doing it to cause their cells to do more autophagy. I'm not really someone who likes to fast, so I hope that you'll just continue in your research and keep figuring out ways that I don't have to fast, but I can still get rid of all the weeds and the trash and the garbage between my cells so they can communicate better.
Yeah, beautiful point. And in fact, the Nobel Prize was won in 2017 by a Japanese scientist that invented autophagy. So it's hot on the press. It's very, very topical.
And it
at
translates
this stage
to
of the game. So you're right. That's
it
the waste
translates to
management. I
eating
like it.
yourself too, which I think is so funny. It's a great word.
Yeah, exactly.
Great word and great
Digest.
science.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? And thank you so much for your time. It has been wonderful to get to peek into your brilliant brain and hear about how you had these great ideas. Anything else you have?
Well, it's always fun, and I don't often have a forum to be able to spew out science, so it's been a pleasure for me as well, Leslie. I appreciate it. And
Yeah, we'll have to do an aging
anytime.
one because
Yeah.
you have so many great aging products too. All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.